Courage rarely begins with strength. It begins with trembling, with the quiet awareness that something inside can no longer stay asleep. Carl Jung believed that what most people call courage is not fearlessness, but a reconciliation with fear, a willingness to look into the darkness of the soul and not run. Because what terrifies us most is rarely the world outside. It is the world within. If this feels familiar, stay with me. We are taught to equate courage with boldness, with visible acts of defiance or resilience. But Jung saw courage as something deeper, the psychic act of facing one's own unconscious. He wrote that the greatest burden a person carries is their unlived life, all the choices avoided, all the truths silenced, in order to remain accepted. To live courageously, then, is not to climb mountains or shout one's truth into crowds, but to descend into the personal abyss of shadow, contradiction, and fear. Because until we face what we fear in ourselves, we are merely performing life, not living it. Many people spend decades avoiding what their soul keeps whispering. Avoidance becomes personality. The fear of rejection disguises itself as politeness. The fear of failure hides behind perfectionism. The fear of intimacy wears the mask of independence. Each adaptation protects us for a while, but slowly imprisons us in a self that is only half alive. Jung understood that the parts of us we repress do not disappear. They wait. They gather energy in the dark, and the longer they wait, the louder they become, through anxiety, conflict, emptiness, dreams. Life itself begins to conspire toward our wholeness. That is the strange mercy of the psyche. It will not let us rest in what is false. When people say they are breaking down, what they often mean is that their inner system can no longer sustain the lie of who they pretended to be. Courage is born in that breaking, because to live without pretense means facing the terrifying question: who am I when I am no longer who they needed me to be? The courageous life begins in small moments of honesty. When you say the thing you were afraid would push someone away, when you rest instead of performing usefulness, when you allow grief to move through you instead of hiding it behind strength. Each of these is a quiet revolution. Each is the soul reclaiming a fragment of its truth. Jung believed that every act of courage brings the conscious self closer to the self, the deep, organizing intelligence of the psyche that seeks unity, not approval. But the journey toward that unity is not gentle. It demands a confrontation with the shadow, the sum of everything we deny about ourselves, the anger we rationalize, the envy we project, the vulnerability we shame. The courage to live truthfully depends on our capacity to look at these disowned aspects without collapsing into guilt or superiority. Most people are afraid of their shadow because it threatens their identity. We would rather call others selfish than admit our own moments of manipulation. We would rather romanticize goodness than acknowledge how often our virtue masks a hunger to be loved. Courage, in Jung's sense, is the humility to see oneself as human, completely, imperfectly human. That humility transforms everything, because when you no longer need to be pure, you can finally be whole. And wholeness, not purity, is the ground of authentic courage. It is what allows a person to stand in the tension between opposites, strength and softness, ambition and rest, reason and emotion, without collapsing into one extreme. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity to hold contradictions until a new truth emerges between them. Courage lives there, not in control, but in surrender to complexity. You can recognize people living from that place. They do not rush to defend their image. They do not need the world to agree. There is a steadiness in them, born of having met their own chaos and survived. They can sit in silence without needing to fill it, because they have stopped running from themselves. The greatest paradox of courage is that it feels like surrender, not a battle cry, but a deep exhale. I am willing to see all of me. Yet many of us resist that exhale for years. We build identities on achievements, relationships, beliefs, anything that keeps us from falling inward. But life, in Jung's view, has a way of dismantling false structures. Through loss, betrayal, illness, failure, the outer walls crumble until we have no choice but to turn inward and meet what's been waiting. And when we do, we discover that courage was never about becoming fearless. It was about remembering that the soul is vast enough to hold both fear and love, both despair and hope, both the darkness and the light. That is the secret Jung kept pointing toward. Courage is not an act, it's an alignment. The alignment of the ego with the deeper wisdom of the self. And that alignment begins the moment we stop trying to be someone else's idea of strong. But what happens when the world around us still demands that performance? What does it mean to live courageously when others fear your authenticity? That question begins to unfold quietly, like a tremor beneath the surface of every relationship. The price of being true in a world that rewards masks. And that is where the next descent begins. To live courageously is to live in tension with one's surroundings, because authenticity disrupts systems built on conformity. When you start telling the truth, even gently, people around you feel it. Some will be drawn closer, relieved by your honesty. Others will pull away, threatened by the mirror it holds up. This is the moment when most people retreat. We begin to equate rejection with wrongness, forgetting that rejection is simply evidence of divergence. Courage demands that you stay with the discomfort of being misunderstood, because meaning, not approval, must become your compass. Jung often spoke of the path of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, distinct from the collective identities that shape you. It is not a path of isolation, but of differentiation, learning to remain connected while no longer imprisoned by belonging. That balance between individuality and relationship is one of the hardest forms of courage, because the human heart longs to be seen. And yet, to live authentically, you must be willing to be unseen by those who cannot yet meet you there. You can feel this tension in your chest when you withhold a truth for the sake of harmony. A quiet contraction, a subtle fatigue. Your body always knows when you betray yourself, and it also knows when you reclaim yourself. That deep breath after saying, "This is who I am." The trembling relief after setting a boundary. These are not small acts. They are the nervous system, learning that safety can exist in honesty. Jung would have said that this is the point where courage becomes sacred. Because it is no longer about social bravery, it is a psychic movement toward integration. Every time you choose truth over approval, the self expands. And as the self expands, life begins to mirror that expansion. New people, new opportunities, new forms of resonance appear. Not because you have forced them, but because your inner alignment reshapes your outer world. That is the metaphysical symmetry Jung hinted at. The inner and outer are not separate. They are mirrors of one another. But this expansion also brings loneliness. Individuation always involves a period of solitude, when the old connections dissolve and the new have not yet formed. This is where many lose heart. They mistake the silence of transition for failure, the absence of validation for wrongness. Yet this space, empty, uncertain, sacred, is where courage matures into wisdom. Because courage without patience becomes recklessness. Only when you learn to rest in the in-between can you hear what your soul is actually saying. Sometimes the most courageous act is to do nothing, to sit still while everything in you wants to grasp for control, to let the old identity disintegrate, trusting that something deeper is assembling beneath the surface. Jung described this as the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious, where the ego dies to its old form so that something larger can emerge. This is not metaphorical death. It feels like loss, confusion, numbness. But beneath that darkness, the psyche is reorganizing itself around a greater truth. People rarely recognize this when they are in it. They call it depression or burnout. And yes, it can look like both. But often, it is the soul refusing to keep living half-heartedly. The psyche withdraws its energy from false structures so that a more authentic life can be born. That is courage in its quietest form, to trust that the collapse has meaning. If you listen closely during those times, you might hear faint symbols rising from the unconscious, dreams, intuitions, synchronicities. Jung saw these as the language of the soul. They are not coincidences. They are communications from the deeper self, guiding the conscious mind toward integration. And each time you honor them, even slightly, you strengthen your relationship with that inner source of courage. Still, courage does not end with inner discovery. It must find expression. The self does not individuate in isolation. It seeks incarnation, to be lived, spoken, embodied. And when you begin to live from that deeper alignment, the world responds in kind. New creative impulses surface. You feel drawn to what once seemed impossible. The fear does not vanish, but it loses authority. Because you have touched something more enduring than fear. Yet every transformation carries a test, a return to the world that once defined you. How do you stay true when faced with the familiar expectations? How do you carry the light of the inner world into the noise of the outer one? That is the next frontier of courage, not the descent into shadow, but the return to embodiment. And the question that lingers is this: can you hold your wholeness in a world that still prefers fragments? That is where the final unfolding begins. Living courageously through the Jungian lens means living in dialogue with the unknown. It means recognizing that what you call life is a conversation between the conscious and the unconscious, between what you know and what you are still becoming. Every challenge, every attraction, every fear, is an invitation from the self, asking, "Will you meet me here?" The outer world becomes a mirror of the inner. The people who irritate you reveal your unowned traits. The ones you admire show you the potentials you have not yet claimed. Life, in its entirety, becomes a form of psychological alchemy, transforming opposites into wholeness through awareness. And courage is the fire that fuels that alchemy. Without it, the opposites remain split. With it, they merge into wisdom. There is a quiet dignity in people who have lived this process. They do not chase certainty. They listen. They allow mystery to remain mystery without turning it into dogma. They understand that courage is not a single act, but a way of being. A willingness to stay open when closing would be easier. This openness is the bridge between the human and the divine within us. Because when you meet your own unconscious with compassion, you begin to see the same complexity in everyone else. Judgment softens. Empathy deepens. You stop needing people to be simple. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege is earned through continual acts of courage, to see, to feel, to integrate. To become who you are is to die again and again to who you were yesterday. And yet, each death reveals more life. Each surrender uncovers more authenticity. Each confrontation with fear becomes a reunion with strength. In this sense, courage is not a trait, but a relationship between the ego and the soul, the known and the unknown. It deepens with every honest conversation, every moment of stillness, every time you choose meaning over comfort. And as that relationship matures, the need for outer validation begins to dissolve. You no longer seek applause because you have learned to hear the applause of your own integrity. Still, the journey never ends. Even the most self-aware person carries undiscovered shadows. The unconscious is endless, and so is the invitation to courage. Each new stage of life, love, loss, aging, creation, opens another doorway into the depths. The work is not to conquer these depths, but to accompany them with awareness. To keep asking, what truth is this experience asking me to live? Sometimes that truth will cost you something, relationships, certainty, identity, but it will give you something greater, a felt sense that you are aligned with life itself, that you are not pretending anymore, that even in fear, you are real. And that realness, trembling, imperfect, luminous, is the essence of courage. Jung never promised comfort. He promised wholeness. And wholeness is rarely easy. But it is beautiful in its honesty, a life that breathes in rhythm with its own depth. To live courageously, then, is to become an instrument of that rhythm. To trust that even when you cannot see the path, something in you is walking it faithfully. And perhaps that is where courage ultimately leads us, not to certainty, but to intimacy with the mystery of being alive. The kind of intimacy that whispers, "You are not here to be fearless. You are here to be whole." And wholeness, in its quiet bravery, is what turns a life into meaning. There comes a point when courage no longer feels like fire. It feels like quiet. After all the storms of becoming, you find yourself walking through familiar streets with unfamiliar eyes. You notice how every choice now hums with awareness. You cannot betray yourself without feeling it vibrate through your body. This is the hidden stage Jung spoke of. Integration. When courage stops being something you do and becomes something you are. It's in the small things now. Choosing rest over rush. Speaking truth softly, even when it might disappoint. Letting people misunderstand you, rather than abandoning your depth. Courage used to look like movement. Now it looks like stillness that doesn't collapse. It's the strength to stay tender in a world that mistakes numbness for power. You start to see that love and courage have always been the same impulse. Both require exposure. Both demand presence. To love deeply is to risk loss. To live honestly is to risk rejection. But the alternative is a slow suffocation of the soul. So you keep choosing truth, even when your voice shakes. Because something in you has tasted wholeness, and you cannot go back to fragments. There's a peace that arrives when you stop fighting the fear and start listening to it. It tells you what still matters. It shows you where life is asking for more honesty, more trust, more letting go. You realize that courage isn't about defeating fear, but befriending it, learning to walk beside it without giving it the map. Eventually, even courage dissolves into trust. You stop needing life to unfold on your terms. You begin to sense a quiet rhythm guiding everything, a conversation between what you choose and what chooses you. The Jungian path ends not in conquest, but in communion with your shadow, your longing, your aliveness. And in that communion, you discover what you were searching for all along. Not to be fearless, but to be real. Not to control life, but to let it move through you with open hands and an open heart that whispers, I am still here.